Welcome to Back to Basics, a new IDPE podcast in association with Schools Management Plus. I am Simon Lerwill, Director of Development at Marlborough College and Chair of IDPE. And each week we hear from an experienced development leader who is part of IDPE's New to Development programme and an expert in a particular area of fundraising and engagement. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Lesley Dowdall, Director of Development at Withington Girls School. Today, Lesley's going to be sharing her experience and expertise on demonstrating impact. Welcome, Lesley.
Thank you, Simon.
So before we get into that, we start each podcast with a bit of an icebreaker question, which is, what's the fundraising or engagement idea that you wish you had thought of and why?
Yeah, I've thought quite hard about this question, and I think my answer is more of a concept. So I'm hoping this is going to make sense to listeners. But a former boss of mine used to talk about getting fundraising right when donors feel they've been invited to your side of the table, that you're standing side by side, looking at a problem together and working out how best we can sort of solve that together. And that power of inviting donors behind the scenes, if you like, and sharing with them carefully, obviously, your vision, the challenges you're facing, and the power they feel in having the ability to help shape and co-create those projects and programs, I've seen to be incredibly powerful. So that's probably one thing I'd share there.
So making them insiders and making them feel special and then co-creating things rather than just giving them a fait accompli.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sometimes we present our donors, this is what we're doing. We've already sorted it all out. Here's the glossy printed brochure. Are you in or are you out? And not having sort of that ability to shape things, it can be off-putting, or rather the other way around, it can be more inspiring for donors to have that opportunity to be in at the beginning and helping shape things. And as you say, not be presented with that fait accompli that it's all decided and done.
Yeah, I think particularly for the larger donations, the bigger projects, I think often you can't beat shaping them early with that major donor coming alongside you, for sure. Oh, that's a great one. I completely agree. And something I think we need to do more of as fundraisers. So you worked at the University of Manchester for a long time, didn't you, Lesley? Almost 20 years before Withington. And as you know, I also worked in HE where our paths crossed.
They did indeed.
And they're still crossing now. What do you think are the key differences between working in HE and schools?
Well, the obvious one is scale. The scale of the operations at universities is larger. I think we had an alumni database in the 450,000 alums at Manchester. It's order of magnitude smaller of that at the school. The targets, the projects are tend to be order of magnitude bigger as well. But there's a lot of similarities. We're all engaging our constituents in and building those relationships to further our missions and visions. And we, both universities and schools, have a hopefully warm cohort already identified as potential donors, particularly in schools, as obviously alums and parents. I think the other thing that struck me moving from the HE sector to the school sector was the frenetic pace in schools during term time. Universities obviously have terms, semesters, but the impact of those are nowhere near as great, certainly on the development team, as in a school. You don't have the same sort of frenetic workload with yourselves and your colleagues that we see in term time in schools. So trying to sort of get attention and bandwidth of colleagues who are extremely busy is sort of more even in a university, if you like, across the year.
So scale and pace, which reminds me for some reason of a 90s comedy act. That's your
yes, listeners have
there's a conference session title.
Yes, absolutely. Scale and pace. There we are.
Yeah. I always think as well, I mean, the big thing universities have, of course, in terms of scale, is that scale of projects. So because you have all the research, so you can be raising money for cancer research or climate change or whatever it might be, in going back to that co-creation point, just that ability to speak to any donor and you will find something, you better match something that they're going to be passionate about.
Which is a huge privilege to be able to do that, a huge challenge to be able to do that as well. So I think there's pros and cons to having that sort of broad range of projects that are requiring support, but there's also a nice thing about having actually a much smaller range of projects requiring support that you can focus on. So I wouldn't say one was better than the other. I said one is just different than the other.
Yeah, completely. Good. Okay. Right. Demonstrating impact. That is the main theme of the podcast. And increasingly, philanthropists, donors are, I think, rightly interested in seeing the direct impact they're giving. And we're seeing more and more charities putting an emphasis on this. So the first question is, why do you think demonstrating impact is important?
I think the answer to this question is can be different depending on who you're demonstrating that impact to, because we all demonstrate our impact to different audiences. So, for example, externally, we're demonstrating the impact of giving and philanthropy to the donors, to prospective donors, to hopefully inspire them to lend their support as well, to volunteers. We mustn't forget people who are volunteering their time and the impact they have as well. Obviously, the end goal of that is to thank donors, to motivate them to keep giving and to inspire others to join them. We also feed back internally to stakeholders, whether that's the senior leadership team, governing body, colleagues across our organisations. And we do that to get buy-in especially important when we're seeking new resources, but to get colleagues to support our work. We all know fundraising is not done in a vacuum. It is a team game. And if we aren't able to demonstrate the impact of what we're doing to our colleagues and our senior leadership team, then they're going to be less likely to get involved. And I think the final thing I'd say here probably is also to ourselves and our teams. If we don't know what success looks like, are we going to be less motivated? I think it's really motivating and encouraging to be able to sit down halfway through the year, the end of the year, wherever you do it, look back and say, this is how far we've come. This is the impact we've had, because it's job satisfaction and it motivates you to keep going for the next year and the year after. So I think that depends on who you're talking to, which audience you're demonstrating that impact to.
I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, because I think a lot of people, when they think about demonstrating impact, are thinking about outwards, externally, to donors, and they're talking about donor reports and stewardship videos and whatever it might be. But I don't think we think enough about it internally, facing internally and engaging, showing our impact, as you say, to our colleagues and to the senior management team, and even to ourselves. I really like that. I think that's really important that we think of it in different ways to different audiences.
Yeah, and I think we are relationship managers at the end of the day, particularly those of us that have a background in major gifts, and we are building relationships. And I think one of the things that perhaps isn't articulated when you start out in development is that you spend almost as much time developing those internal relationships, because they are incredibly important as well. So we do invest time and effort, not just with the relations with our donors and potential donors, but with our colleagues and stakeholders and governors and other volunteers as well.
For sure. Yes. Okay. So how do you measure and demonstrate impact at Withington then? Give us some examples of what good practice.
Yeah, of course. So obviously it depends on the audience, as we've just been talking about. So internally, it was interesting when I first started at Withington. So I came from the HE sector, as we've talked about, who have all kinds of KPIs, key performance indicators.
They love a metric in HE.
Love a metric. So I came in and I had metrics, sort of headline metrics, and then enabling metrics, supporting those that I reported to the governors. And then as I got to know the governing body a little bit better, I understood actually they didn't need all that information. And really it was sort of 3 or 4 real headline KPIs that they were interested in, all related to our strategic development plan, which in turn related to the school's overarching development plan. So really looking at sort of that top down, how are we supporting what the school wants to do going forwards? I always make sure I have at least one metric in there talking about the impact we have in terms of alumni relations.
Hmm.
arguably harder to measure, perhaps harder for people to understand. A cash in, very easy for people to understand. But
Mm.
I include measures on alumni engagement as well, because it supports so many of the programmes that we're doing at Withington. And I'll come on to talk a little bit more about sort of stories and the qualitative versus quantitative. But I also include some stories in there as well. We focus on bursary provision and fundraising for our bursary programme. So actually feeding back to the senior leadership team and the governing body a story of a bursary holder. This is what we've been able to do. This is the type of people we're able to support, because we mustn't forget that our leadership team and our governors they're humans as well, so they respond to that just as well. But talking about stories externally, I always do include some facts and figures, how many bursaries we've supported, how our bursary holders perform in external exams, which is just as well as our fee-paying pupils. But I also focus far more on stories and the power of a story and a relatable case study, if you like. We've all seen children in need appeals on the television, and it's no secret that during those powerful, emotional stories and case studies of a beneficiary, that's when the donations spike. That's when they see more people picking up the phone or going online to make their gifts. And our donors, I think, are no different. They relate to individuals. People give to people at the end of the day. And one of the things I did at Withington to help with this is that we launched a bursary ambassadors programme. So we now invite all our sixth form bursary holders, if they so choose, to identify as a bursary ambassador. And it means I've got a cohort of pupils who I know are happy to talk about being a bursary recipient. And they write thank you letters to donors, recorded thank you messages. They've met with donors or potential donors when they've come into school. And so it's been hugely powerful. And I always say to them that our donors, they're not really interested in hearing from me. They are interested in hearing from the headmistress, but they're really interested in hearing from people like them. So that's been a really powerful addition to our development programme.
I really we have bursary ambassadors as well, so I second that. But I really like the way you say that donors and governors are both human, right? So I think externally, a lot of schools are very good at sharing not just the facts but the stories, because we know that different people are motivated by different things. But you know, people love those human stories, and yet internally, it's often very data driven and
Mm,
reporting numbers, and we don't report the stories, and yet
yeah.
they're still humans who will be moved by those stories. I think that's a really interesting
Yeah,
point.
I try and share, and I've started to share it with colleagues across the school as well. Some of the thank you letters that bursary ambassadors have written, I've shared those, across the whole staff so that they can understand the full impact of the bursary programme as
Yeah.
well. So it can be extremely powerful. And I've seen donors move to tears by receiving handwritten letters from the students that they've been supporting. And that's, it's not to be underestimated.
Yeah, completely. Very powerful. Okay. Final question on impact then. What are the biggest challenges do you think to demonstrating impact?
Oh, I think one of them is figuring out what you should be measuring, and also what you can measure. Just because you should measure it doesn't mean you can. And just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should, if you like. So understanding your own development strategy and how that relates to the school strategy will help you understand actually what you should be tracking and measuring to report internally. And I think often, perhaps as a sector, certainly it's something we've been guilty of in the past, is letting the organisation get in the way of when we're talking about impact. So we often talk about what the school has been able to do. We have done this. We have created this amazing programme. We have supported these pupils. And actually, yes, we have, but it's our donors that have enabled us to do that. So switching it round, rather than talking about the school first and we and what we've done, talking about the donors, what you have done, what you have enabled,
Yeah, for sure.
I think can be powerful as well. So that's certainly something we've been guilty of in the past, and sort of trying to reframe sort of all those sort of communications around that as well. And I think sometimes it can be difficult to compare what you're doing to the national picture. So how are the IDPE benchmarking certainly helps when comparing yourselves perhaps to similar-ish schools. But how can we compare our pupils' outcomes if they weren't at our school, that sort of sliding doors scenario? And that potentially is a little bit more tricky. There is some data out there. But certainly when I was looking at sort of demographic data around Manchester before the new census was out, the old data was almost 10 years old, and sort of things like that. So it can be tricky, but there are ways of doing it, I think.
Yes, no, it can be. That's one of the issues of any data, isn't it? That sometimes getting what you want can be difficult. I think we find measuring the impact of bursaries on the school rather than the recipients themselves a lot harder to find data on, to measure, to come up with meaningful kind of data around. So yes, it can be difficult. Right, final question. What's the one piece of advice you'd wish you'd been given when you started out?
I think this is just go and talk to people. Don't wait until you've got your perfect prospect pipeline all sorted out and the perfect prospect research report before you can actually go and meet somebody, because just going and having conversations is going to teach you an awful lot. Even if you're not ready to start asking people yet, it will help to test and shape and frame your case for support. It will provide you with insights of what people know, what they don't know. I remember somebody speaking to a current parent about the bursary programme who said, "Oh, I just thought it was help for the odd school trip here and there," which made me realise how little our parent body actually knew about it. And bursary ambassadors were sort of one of many ways we're trying to solve that. But you'll just find out stuff and you'll have conversations. It's the best prospect research there is just going to talk to people. So just get out there and start having conversations, and good things will start to happen.
Very good. Yeah, I completely agree. I think when you start out as an early major gift fundraiser, you try and hold on to all sorts of kind of crutches of case for support documents and researching the person you're going to meet to the nth degree. And you can understand why, but the more you do, as you say, the more you realize that all you need to do is get out from behind your desk and just go start talking to people. 100%.
Yeah, and well, absolutely. And as back to what we were talking about at the beginning of inviting people to your side of the table, you don't need always, maybe never, that glossy printed case for support. No. Going out and testing some things, test some messages. What resonates more with you? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? Will help you craft that case for support, and you'll learn more with each meeting, and you'll learn more about each donor or each potential donor with each meeting as well.
There's no major donor on this earth who's ever given because of a glossy brochure. I think we can agree on that.
No, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Lesley, for sharing your time and expertise today. And finally, a reminder, you can hear more from Lesley talking about demonstrating impact as part of IDPE's New to Development programme. This launches in November and provides an introduction to all of the fundamentals of schools fundraising and engagement. So whether you're new to the sector or in the process of setting up an office at your school, head to the IDPE website to find out more. Thanks for listening. See you next time.